Hey, what's up, Pokersavvy? It's Matt Wakeman here, aka MJW006, and today I'm going to be bringing you guys part 1 of a 3-part series dedicated to learning the fundamentals of heads-up sit-and-goes. Hopefully this in turn should help you guys comfortably beat the low to mid-stakes heads-up sit-and-goes. So today in part 1, we're really just going to be building the basics and fundamentals and getting a good feel for some broad heads-up sit-and-go concepts. We're going to go over heads-up sit-and-goes in general, touch on a little bit of pre-flop play, and move on to some early game strategies. Once we've dealt with some of the theoretical concepts, we're going to fire up a couple of tables and look to apply the concepts that we've gone through in the first part of the video to some real game situations. So before I did move forward today, I just wanted to talk about this first point right here. In today's day and age, there's somewhat of a stigma carried with the term sit-and-go. A lot of people in the poker community now believe that sit-and-goes in general are a conquered game. However, this is more relative to single-table tournaments, given concepts such as ICM and software such as Sit-and-Go Wizard, which has really affected the edge that a good player has in them forms of the game. Unfortunately, however, this stigma to a degree carries over to heads-up sit-and-go, whereby a lot of people believe that heads-up sit-and-goes are also a conquered form of poker. I can honestly say, in my experience, that there is no way in hell that heads-up sit-and-goes are a conquered form of poker. Being a heads-up form of poker, the skill edge that you can carry over an opponent by merely following good fundamentals and a sound understanding of heads-up sit-and-go play is quite significant. Even though there's now theories such as Nash Equilibrium and Sage, which are late-game strategies that we're going to touch on later in this series, the edge that you can carry from start to finish of a heads-up sit-and-go is still really significant. So what I seek to do is help you guys build them fundamentals and get that understanding of heads-up sit-and-goes that you can carry that edge into your games. So hopefully we've dispelled any rumours that heads-up sit-and-goes are a conquered game, so we can now move forward a little bit. Basically, heads-up sit-and-goes are a tournament form of poker. In a heads-up sit-and-go, you start with a dedicated amount of chips, with blinds increasing at regular intervals until there's an eventual winner. So that's how they're structured. But this third point right here is probably the most important point on this slide. Heads-up cash skills or MTT skills. I'm of the firm belief that you need a good combination of both skill sets in order to be successful in heads-up sit-and-goes. So what I want to do right now is go over it with you guys, how heads-up sit-and-goes are like heads-up cash, how they're not like heads-up cash, and how they are like MTTs. So first of all, we're going to have a look at the starting stack. You start 75 big blinds deep typically in heads-up sit-and-goes. Obviously this varies from site to site, and a little bit depending on what style of game you play, but as a default we're going to say 75 big blinds deep is pretty standard. As opposed to heads-up cash, which generally starts 100 or 200 big blinds deep, and you have the ability to reload, this is obviously a little bit shallow. And obviously in heads-up sit-and-goes you don't have that ability to reload your stack. In saying this, however, 75 big blinds deep is still relatively deep. So you are going to need a good solid understanding of post-flop play, things such as board textures, c-betting, barreling, when to check raise, elements of heads-up sit-and-goes which really relate to heads-up cash games. We're going to go over a lot of these elements throughout the series and get a good understanding of them. Also relating to heads-up cash is probably the most important point, which is this last point right here, and I am going to harp on it, unfortunately for you guys, a little bit throughout this session, and probably throughout all of the sessions throughout the series. And that is your ability to adjust and adapt to your opponents. This relates to your ability to think on your feet, and be constantly adjusting and adapting to both match dynamics and your opponent's tendencies. This is a really important facet of the game, and as I said, I am going to harp on this a little bit throughout the series, so I won't bore you too much with it now. When we move forward, obviously as we progress through the match, our stack size is constantly changing, and the depth of our stacks is getting shorter. Therefore, we're going to have a good understanding of these 2 points right here. MTT pre-flop play and mid to late game MTT skills. What I mean by both of these, when dealing with MTT pre-flop play, this is more relating to the constantly changing stack sizes and the range of hands that you're going to play, or the range of hands that you're going to go to the felt with, given a certain stack size. For example, you don't really want to be opening for 3 times the big blind with a less than 15 big blind stack and folding to a re-steal or a 3-bet. There's certain points in your stack size where certain things are applicable and certain things aren't applicable. You really need to have a good understanding of these things, and again, we're going to work on these throughout the series. When I refer to mid to late game MTT skills, I'm really talking about a couple of concepts such as re-stealing, stop and going, and a couple of other plays and strategies which are more specific to multi-table tournaments and more specifically mid to late game multi-table tournaments. So these factors really come into play, obviously late game in a heads up sit and go, and I think you need to have a good understanding of these concepts in order to be successful at heads up sit and goes. At the end of the day, heads up sit and goes are a highly profitable and low variance form of poker. They're particularly low variance in comparison to heads up cash or multi-table tournaments. So one of the first things that a lot of people ask when they're thinking about getting into heads up sit and goes is, what bankroll do I need to be playing on it? Generally, I tell people that around about 20 buy-ins is a pretty safe default, and your risk of ruin at 20 buy-ins is relatively low, providing that you're willing to move up and down accordingly, and letting your bankroll dictate what limits you play. I think this point right here is really important, letting the bankroll dictate what limits you're playing. I've seen too many really good, talented players come and go due to their ego getting the better of them. That is, that they think that they have the skill set to be playing, let's say, the $200 or the $500 heads-up sit and goes, but their bankroll really doesn't allow them to do that. And obviously they go busto because of that. I think you really need to let your bankroll dictate what limits you play, and not let your ego dictate what limits you play. Lastly, on bankroll, I really think that it's important to be comfortable. If you're not comfortable playing with 20 buy-ins and you're going to be more comfortable playing with 30 buy-ins, then that's obviously fine as well. Don't really use this, only use this as a guide. Don't necessarily use it as like the Bible or anything like that. So the next thing we're going to talk about is game type considerations. Obviously there's a couple of factors here, that being site and what actual style of heads up sit and go you decide to play. The first thing here is site considerations, and all of the major sites offer heads up sit and goes, as far as I know anyway. But there are the 2 major sites, which is PokerStars and Full Tilt Poker, which offer the certain different types of heads up sit and goes, and they offer a wider variety of elements to them heads up sit and goes. One of these elements or nuances that Full Tilt Poker in particular offers that I think is really advantageous for you guys is a rematch button. It allows you to find bad players or players you enjoy playing against, and at the end of each match it gives you the option, provided there's a consensus, to actually take a rematch and continue to play that player. I think that's a really, really cool element of Full Tilt Poker's heads up sit and goes. The other factor here is the type of heads up sit and go you choose to play. So obviously there's a couple, with the major ones being turbo, regular speed, and the deep no blind increase heads up sit and goes that you find on PokerStars. Each type of heads up sit and go is going to affect you differently. By that I mean that your win rate, your dollar per hour, and your variance is going to be different depending on which style you choose to play. But once again, obviously, you need to choose what you're comfortable with. So let's say you're really comfortable with push folding strategy. Maybe turbos are the best way for you to go about your business. Maybe you like getting games done with and continually playing lots of games per hour and running through them. But obviously the flip side of that is that your variance is going to be much higher. Even though you're pumping through a lot of games, the variance that you encounter throughout your heads up sit and go career is going to be a lot greater. Obviously regular speed are exactly that. They fall somewhere in the middle, and your deep no blind increase are really going to suit someone who has a lot of heads up cash game skills, with you generally starting about 200 big blinds deep there. Unfortunately with those, however, a game may last 2.5 or 3 hours, so your actual dollar per hour is going to be really low, even though the variance is also going to be really low. So you can really push your edge to a greater effect in a deep no blind increase as opposed to a turbo or a regular speed game. So they're the different styles, and if you really are unsure of what you actually will enjoy, I suggest that you try each of them out and get a good feel for each of them, and then decide what you're comfortable with. So the last point here is the importance of game selection, and I really feel that this is something that a lot of players overlook. Even really good players tend to overlook this, but game selection can really add a couple of points to your ROI. These days, with tools such as SharkScope, FishScope, officialpokerrankings.com, you can quickly and effectively look up your opponent's stats before you even sit down with them. And what this allows you to do is take a look at their stats, and when you take a look at their stats, you can have a look at their ROI, that being their return on investment, the amount of games that they've played, their win rate, and what their current form is. You can really have a look at all them things and then decide if you want to play that particular player. If you're a beginner or you're just starting out in heads-up sit-and-goes, you may not want to play, someone who has a really good stats and has carried a 15% ROI over 10,000 games. That might not be the type of player that you want to necessarily jump in and get your feet wet with. You really may want to have a look at playing someone with a negative ROI and really start getting into it that way. So game selection can be important in that way. But in the long run, as well as that, game selecting well, as I said, can tack a couple of points onto your ROI. Now, FishScope here, I'm not sure if a lot of you guys have heard of it. I'm sure you've heard of SharkScope and officialpokerrankings.com. But FishScope's a really cool program that's only available on Full Tilt Poker. And what it does is it allows you to just run your mouse cursor over a lobby, and it brings the stats up on your screen for you. So it gives you the ROI, the amount of games, as well as the current form and the graph of the player that is sitting in that lobby at that particular time. This is a really cool tool and allows you to game select well, quickly and efficiently at any given point in time. Unfortunately, however, I do think that SharkScope is banned on PokerStars, so I'm not condoning the use of SharkScope on PokerStars. Okay, so we're going to move on now. So very much like in all forms of poker, position is a huge factor. I understand that this has probably been drilled into you guys throughout most videos you've watched, so I'm not going to harp on it too much, but I do want you to remember how important position is. Especially in heads-up poker, where you're either in position or out of position, playing more hands in position is really important. In regards to hand ranges, I don't really believe it's fair for me to be saying that you should open hands X, Y, and Z, or you should be 3-betting the top 20% of hands, or anything like that. This is something which is really going to change from opponent to opponent, and depending on someone's tendencies, and also your ranges are going to change as effective stacks change. What I will say, however, is that you need to be comfortable with the range that you're opening. Maybe the best thing that you guys can do is open up PokerStove and click on the preflop range button, and there's a little slider bar along the bottom of the screen. Take this slider bar along and have a look at maybe the top 60, top 70, top 80% of hands, and really get a feel for what them ranges actually comprise of, and what you're comfortable opening it from the big blind, flatting from the big blind, opening from the button, what ranges you're going to be happy 3-betting, 4-betting. But as I said, this is going to be really opponent specific, and hopefully we can construct this throughout the series based on different opponents, and you can get a good feel for what ranges should be. Personally, what you're going to see from me is that I'm going to be opening a super wide range from the button against unknowns, and defending a relatively tight range from the big blind. And as I said, I think the best way for you guys to get a feel for preflop ranges is for us to work through the series, and I'm going to be discussing the ranges throughout the live play as we go. Most importantly here are these points that I've obviously been harping on throughout the first part of this video, is being adaptive and being comfortable. So you need to adapt your ranges to your opponent's tendencies and the match dynamics and the stack sizes, but you also need to be comfortable with the ranges that you're opening. Some people may be comfortable opening 100% of their range from the button. They may be comfortable playing in position with any two cards. However, another player may be only comfortable playing, let's say, 6, 7 plus from the button. So obviously, depending on the player, you need to play what hands you're comfortable with from certain positions. The last thing here I'm going to touch on here is raise size. Some people condone min raising, some people condone limping. I, however, tend to stick to this guide down here. And once again, I'm going to say that it is only a guide, and you once again need to do what you're comfortable with. But personally, I open to 3 times the big blind at the 10 and 20 level. When the stacks are still around about 75 big blinds deep, I'm opening to 3 times the big blind. As soon as the blinds go to the second level, which is the 15-30 level, and right through to the 25-50 level, I'm going to be opening around about 2.5 times the big blind. After the 25-50 level, which is the 30-60 level on Full Tilt Poker, I start min-raising. And by that time, the effective stacks generally have dipped below 20 big blinds, so you're going to be folding, using a push-fold strategy maybe, and in some cases you're going to be min-raising. So basically it's going to be either min-raising or shoving at that point in time anyway. So we're going to move on to our first hand example. This is basically just, we're just going to have a look at how I'm going to work through these hands, just so you can get a feel for how we're going to work today, or whatever time it is wherever you are. So effective stacks are 1500 and the blinds are 1020. On each of our hand examples, we're going to have the effective stacks and the blind level up here on the left. So we're dealt king-queen suited in position. We're going to deal with pre-flop play here because that's what we've been talking about. And we're going to go through the actions that we take pre-flop. We're going to say here that it's the first hand of the match, so we have no reads. So pre-flop, we're going to open because this is a very standard open, and we're going to open to 3 times the big blind. Our opponent here, Phil here, decides to 3-bet us to 180. Now, right at this point in time, you have the option of either calling, obviously 4-betting, or folding. Folding is obviously the worst option here. King-queen flops really well, particularly heads up, you're in position. So I suggest that you take a flop with this hand. If you were to 4-bet here, basically, against an unknown, I'm going to assume that they're only going to 5-bet or call our 4-bet with hands which are better than ours, and they're going to be folding all worse hands to a 4-bet. So the best option in this case is going to be to take a flop with our king-queen suited, because it tends to flop really well. In this case, we do take a flop. And of course we flop the nuts because that's how we roll here at Pokersavvy Plus. No, but on a serious note, this was more to do with pre-flop play. And what I want you guys to do throughout the hands that we discuss is not really concentrate on the hand, but more or less concentrate on the thought process that I'm putting forward. So let's move on to early stage play. The early stages of a heads-up sit-and-go are critically important, basically for the rest of the match. First of all, you need to develop a read, categorize your opponent, and establish a sound counter strategy. What I mean by all of this is you need to get a read of your opponent, so get a feel for his tendencies straight up. Categorize your opponent into one of the categories that I'm sure most of you guys are already aware of, and that is whether he is tight aggressive, loose passive, tight passive, maniac. Start working him into a category. I understand that not all players are going to fall into a specific category, and in fact, not many players are going to fall into one specific category. But getting a good feel for your opponent and getting him roughly into a category can allow you to establish a sound counter strategy based on the tendencies that you're going to assume that he'll follow. In establishing a sound counter strategy, we need to adjust our thinking to suit match dynamics and adapt our strategies to our opponent's tendencies. So by this, I basically mean that based on the match dynamics, whether that be an aggressive dynamic, an aggressive pre-flop dynamic, an aggressive post-flop dynamic, a passive dynamic, you need to adjust your way of thinking to suit their match dynamics. And ultimately, you need to be thinking about how you can best use the match dynamics to exploit your opponent. We need to adapt our strategies to our opponent's tendencies. What I mean by this is that our strategies need to basically be a counter strategy to what we feel that our opponent, what direction we feel our opponent is going in. So let's use an example. Let's say that our opponent's opening 70% of his buttons, but he's c-betting absolutely every single flop. That's a tendency that our opponent's shown us, and we need to adapt our strategy to counter that. So rather than check folding a lot of flops, maybe we need to start donk leading out, maybe we need to tighten our button opening range up. Maybe we need to tighten our big blind flatting range up to not let him c-bet so much. Maybe we need to start check raising him. Maybe we need to start floating him by check calling the flops and playing him more on turns. Okay, so we need to adapt our strategy to suit our opponent's tendencies. Okay, so I know I've waffled around a little bit here, but hopefully that's kind of clear to you guys now. So what we're going to do now is we're going to go through a few different types of hands that you're going to encounter. This is specific to early game strategies, and we're going to go through the thought process as well as a couple of little example hands just to get a feel for some early game concepts. So we're going to start off with our weak hands. And the things we need to think about when playing our weak hands are obviously, are we in or out of position? What are the match dynamics at that point in time? And what is our opponent's range, and can we get him to fold? Because our hand strength is obviously going to be weak, we need to think about whether or not we can get him to fold the bigger part of his range. So in our hand example, effective stacks are 1400, the blinds are 10 and 20. We're dealt 5-8 of hearts on the button, which is a pretty standard open from the button. We do open, and our villain calls from the big blind. So for this example, in terms of match dynamics, we're going to say that our opponent's been really passive thus far in the match. He's been flatting a lot from the big blind, and he's been playing super passively post-flop, doing a lot of check calling across multiple streets, and not really betting out with his big hands. On our side, we've been c-betting a lot, but we're starting to adjust that and starting to rein it in a little bit. So right now we get a flop of a6-3, a rainbow flop. Our villain checks to us. What should we do on this flop? Okay, so this flop here, even though he's been check calling a lot of flops, he's also been flatting a lot from the big blind. This is a perfect flop to be c-betting. So he checks to us, we do go ahead and make a standard c-bet of 80 into the pot of 120, and our opponent calls. So right now we need to start thinking about what his range is. So first of all, his action pre-flop was just a call from the big blind. But this doesn't really tell us all that much, considering that he had been calling a lot from the big blind. When he check calls this flop, it also doesn't tell us all that much, because he had been check calling a lot. However, when we had been to showdown, he'd only shown down strong hands. So for this example, we're going to assume that his range right now is a pair of sixes or better, so a pocket pair from sevens through to jacks. We would expect an unknown to, however, be betting queens through to aces pre-flop. We'd probably also expect him to be betting ace-queen and ace-king pre-flop, okay? So even though he hasn't 3-bet us yet, it's only early in the match, so we can be assuming that he is going to 3-bet them hands. So our range for him to check call this flop is a pair of sixes or better, and probably anywhere between ace-4 right through to ace-10. So we take a turn card here, and the turn's the six of spades, completing the full rainbow on the board. And our opponent checks to us again. So with him checking to us again, we once again need to think about what his range is and can we get him to fold. His range here has not changed at all by him checking this turn, because we expect that the range that we defined on the flop, that is the pair of sixes or better, ace-4 to ace-10, is going to be check calling this turn as well. If he did have a pair of sixes on this flop, he's probably going to be check raising, and he's not likely to be folding any A's, okay? So the only range that we probably are folding out here on this turn is probably pocket pairs 7s through to 10s. And even then, we may be hard-pressed getting a fold, because we have been so aggressive, he's seen that, okay? So firing off a double barrel here doesn't really achieve all that much. We get the river 9 of clubs, and our villain leads out 200 into the pot of 280 at us. Okay, so once again we need to think about what our opponent's range is, and can we get him to fold. In order to get him to fold here, we're going to have to put in a fair amount of our stack, okay? So the risk reward here is not going to be significantly great, particularly when we haven't represented much, but our opponent now has represented at least a definitive part of the board. We don't really expect him to be betting his pocket pairs which fall between 7s and 10s, with the exception of pocket 9s, which obviously made a full house on the river. But we do expect him to be betting all his 6s, all his aces here and some bluffs, okay? But the larger part of his range here are going to be hands which have a good part of this board and aren't really going to be folding to a raise even if we do put it in. So once again, I just want to reiterate to you guys that we're not really too worried about their hands here. We're more worried about the thought processes that we're going to take in order to get to conclusions. So we're going to move on to marginal hands here. Once again, as in most situations, we're going to have to think about whether we're in or out of position, but more specifically with marginal hands. We don't really like playing marginal hands out of position, but a lot of the times we don't mind playing them in position because we can utilize things such as pot control to our advantage when we're in position. So we need to think about what our hand strength is and are we ahead of our opponent's range, and is the board scary and can it be on later streets. So in this hand example here, once again effective stacks are around about 1500 and the blinds are at 10 and 20. The match dynamics, our villain's been calling a lot from the big blind and donk betting a lot of his draws. He's been pretty aggressive post-flop. Both of us have been pretty aggressive post-flop, with villain not all that happy to give up flops, but he had been floating and folding a lot of turns. So that's the match dynamics as they stand thus far. So we're dealt Jack 10 of diamonds here on the button, which is a clear open, and once again we open to 3 times the big blind, and our villain calls here from the big blind, making the pot 120. The flop comes Jack 8-3 rainbow. Now this is a really good flop for us, because there's not very many draws on this board, with the exception of 9-10, which is the only genuine draw here, as well as a couple of gut shot straight draws. There's no flush draws on board. So it could be said right at this point in time that our hand is strong. And in fact it really is strong at this point in time. So our opponent checks to us, and we're going to go ahead and bet for value here, making our standard c-bet of 80 into a pot of 120, and our opponent calls. We take a turn of the ace of diamonds. So now we need to think about whether that ace is likely to hit our opponent's range. So what do we know about our opponent thus far? He's been calling a lot from the big blind, he's been check calling a lot of flops. Okay, so this is pretty in line with what he's been doing so far. What range is he doing this with, okay? Well, we expect him to be floating us here with basically any part of this board. We expect him to be floating us with gut shot straight draws, open-ended straight draw, the 9-10 here. We also expect him to be floating us with 3s, 8s, any jack, okay? So including jack stronger than ours, we don't necessarily expect him to be check raising, because he hadn't shown a propensity to do that thus far in the match. We also expect him to be floating us with ace-high, and a couple of king-queen, king-10 type hands, which some opponents tend to float you with on this flop. Whoops. Okay, so we'll go back a little bit. So on the turn, our opponent checks to us, and we need to decide what action to take. Too many opponents, I think, shut down on this card, and they use the ace as a scare card and think that they need to pot control. What I find in situations like this is that you need to bet for value still. When we talked about the range that he floats us with, an ace obviously was still only a small part of that range. Obviously, when I mentioned his range on that flop, it was still relatively wide, okay? We mentioned 3s, 8s, jacks, aces, king, queen, king, 10, okay? There's a lot of hands that we expect him to be floating this flop with, okay? An ace is a small part of that range, so I believe that you still should be betting this turn for value. It does serve a double purpose, however, because what we expect here if we check back this turn is that our opponent's going to lead out at us on a lot of rivers, okay? So by betting 180 into a pot of 280 here, we effectively block our opponent from making that bet on the river and control the pot size and keep control of the pot at the same time. So basically betting this turn, we're controlling the pot size because it's not going to, as much as we're bloating the pot here on the turn with one card to come, we're effectively stopping our opponent from leading out at the river on us. This is obviously unless he has a strong hand. So we do go ahead and bet this turn. We bet 180 into the pot of 280 as I mentioned before, and our opponent calls. So the pot's now 640, And on top of this, as much as I hate saying that we bet for information, because we weren't really betting for information in this situation, we were betting for value, we did actually pick up some information here. And that is that our opponent probably doesn't have the king-queen or king-10 type hands that we had in his range, nor does he probably have a 3. He probably has some 8s, although that's a small part of his range. I expect him to have Jack-X here a lot, or that floated Ace-X that we were worried about. So we go ahead and take a river here, which is a really safe card. The 4 of spades here is basically a complete blank. And we don't expect our opponent to hit this card well, ever. Okay, so on the river, our opponent checks to us, and we need to decide whether we're going to bet or not. Okay, so now we need to decide whether our hand is still strong or whether it's marginal. So we need to think about what actions our opponent's taken throughout the course of this hand. He's check called 2 streets here on us, and we've basically pinned his range down to being Ace-X or Jack-X, okay? Basically, the jacks in his range here, the only jacks in his range that we truly beat here are Jack-9 and possibly Jack-7, even though I really don't feel he has Jack-7 a lot here. So a lot of the jacks in his range, he beats us with. Obviously, all of the aces in his range, he beats us with here. So if we do bet this river here, when we get called, we're only getting called by the Ace-X hands and Jack-9 or better. That's our expectations here. We don't expect to get looked up on this river by 8x, and we certainly don't expect to be getting looked up by a 3. What we do expect, though, if we do bet this river, is that he's going to be folding these hands. So when you think about it like this, if we bet this river, let's say we bet 400 into the pot of 640 here, we're going to be getting called by hands which only by hands which beat us, but we're going to be folding out all better hands. So what I suggest you do here in this situation is you've controlled the pot here on the turn, and you've had control of the pot the whole way. I suggest that in this situation here, you do check back this river. So we're going to move on now to playing made hands. The thinking needs to differ a little bit here when playing made hands. Obviously, the elements that we've talked about in the previous couple of slides, that is being in and out of position, what our hand strength is, are we ahead of our opponent's range, are going to come into mind. But we really need to start thinking about how strong our hand is, and is it ahead of our opponent's range? Is our hand likely to remain the best hand? And how best do we get value? So with our made hands, we need to start thinking about taking value optimal lines. So let's move on to our hand example here. We have effective stacks at 1500 and the blinds at 1530. Once again, we're playing against our mate Phil down here. We're dealt ace-queen offsuit here on the button. Once again, we're going to open our button. This time we're going to open to 80, which is a standard raise size for me at 1530, and our opponent calls from the big blind, making the pot 160. Once again, we're going to use the same dynamics as last time, and that is, just to give you a refresher, Villain's been calling a lot from the big blind and donk betting all of his draws. We have an aggressive post-flop dynamic, with Villain not all that happy to give up flops, but had been floating and folding to second barrels a lot. So we take a flop here, after our opponent calls from the big blind, and we get a flop of Queen 8-9. So we do flop a strong hand here, with top pair, top kicker, but it is a very draw-heavy board. So when we start thinking about is our hand likely to remain the best hand, well, we're not really sure until we get a good idea of our opponent's range. So on the flop here, our opponent donk leads out 100 into the pot of 160 at us. As I mentioned before, given the match dynamics, this generally leads us to believe that he has a draw. What type of draw exactly? We're not 100% sure of, but because our hand is so strong, we're going to go ahead and raise him here for value on this flop. And we make a raise to 320 here. Our opponent calls. So by him bet calling this flop, there's obviously Jack 10 here, which flopped the nuts, that I think is likely to be raising and trying to get it in against us here on this flop. And hands like King Queen, which are also a little vulnerable here, may be trying to 4-bet and get it in on this flop. So when constructing his range, I'm really going to narrow his range here down, considering that he donk led and called our raise, to pair plus draw type hands. So we're going to start thinking that his range here is Queen Jack, Queen 10, 9 10, and some possible flush draws here, some weaker flush draws, even though a lot of his nut flush draws and king high flush draws are going to try to get it in on this flop. The only hands which may be actually slow playing here is maybe Jack 10 of diamonds here, which there aren't very many scare cards for. So after the flop here, when our opponent calls our raise, we take a turn here, and we get the turn as the ace of hearts, which is a brilliant card for our hand. Our opponent checks to us, and we need to decide what to do now. We have a made hand now, being top 2 pair here, on a board which is still really draw heavy and quite threatening. What makes this situation a little bit complicated is that the pot's now 800 and the effective stacks are 1100. On top of this, our hand's now strong enough that we need to start thinking about getting value, as well as thinking about protecting our hand from the draws out on the board. So because our opponent's checked this turn to us, we don't really expect that he has a necessarily super strong hand here. We're really going to weight his range now to them pair plus draw type hands that we were talking about before. But the ace is a good card not only for that reason, but it also counterfeits obviously a flop 2 pair, so an 8-9 or a Queen 8, Queen 9, which are in his big blind flatting range pre-flop, as well as having him drawing a lot thinner with hands like Queen 10, Queen Jack, which had draws to 2 pair. So what are we going to do here now that the pot's 800 and our stack's 1100? Okay, overbet shoving here is a little bit excessive, and I think you lose a little bit of value by doing that. Our hand is now a favourite over a lot of the draws, so I suggest that we just bet anywhere from 500 to 550 into this pot of 800 here to best get value, and leave us with a bet size on the river, which is not too small, yet we're still committed here on the turn. If you're not comfortable with that and you feel like there is a chance that you are going to fold on some scary rivers, maybe bet a little bit more to commit yourself to this pot. So anywhere in the 600 to 650 range. So anyway, as it is, we end up betting 550 into this pot and our opponent calls. And the river comes with a complete brick. Our opponent checks to us again and we obviously just shove it in. Okay? So when we're thinking about a made hand, we need to be thinking about all of these elements here. So is our hand likely to remain the best hand, and how do we take a value optimal line, okay? Obviously with a hand like this, we want to be pumping the money into the pot and bloating the pot as much as we can on the streets, but still keeping our opponent in with some of his draws, letting him take the worst of it. So our final type of hand here that we're going to move on to is playing monsters. When playing monsters, once again, we need to be thinking about them factors that we discussed earlier, whether we're in position or out of position, what our opponent's range is. But we need to start really thinking about how to best get value out of our opponent's range. Once we define our opponent's range, we need to think about best getting value and what our opponent's tendencies are that we can exploit him to get money out of him. So in this match here, the effective stacks are 1300 with the blinds at 1530. Our opponent's a different type of fill this time, a weak passive type of fill, and he's been limping all of his buttons, he's been really passive post-flop, and he's shown us that he can lay down big hands. So we get dealt pocket fours here in the big blind. Our opponent does something strange here, and he min-raises his button to 60. Obviously we're going to call with this hand for pure set value against this opponent. We expect him to have a pretty strong hand in this situation, considering that he'd limped every button so far, and now he decided to go ahead and raise. So we just call here from the big blind, and we get basically a dream flop. We expect his range for raising the button here is going to be ace, queen plus, as well as pocket tens and greater. Okay? Maybe we're going to widen that to maybe ace 10 plus, just for argument's sake. So, on this flop, what action should we take to best get value? This ace clearly hits a lot of our opponent's range, and we're going to be folding out pocket pairs 10s right through to kings if he was to have them hands. But we don't really expect to get value out of them hands on later streets with this ace on board, playing against a weak tight opponent. So I think the best bet here is to go ahead and donk lead out at this flop. It's a really dry board, and we want to start building the pot against hands which do hit this ace here. So we go out and lead at this flop, and our opponent raises to 250. This sends off alarm bells here. Well, not alarm bells, but it basically tells us that he has hit this ace, okay? And this ace only. Against this particular opponent, we're going to say that he's absolutely 100% has ace 10 plus. So we just call here. We don't really want to scare him off, because if he was to have ace jack or ace queen here, he's likely to fold if we put more money in on this flop, okay? And he's because he has shown us that he can fold big hands, we don't really want to scare him off just yet. So the turn comes with the 8 of hearts, okay? So this is probably not a good card for our perceived range, because he would expect us to be bet calling this flop with an 8. However, we do now think that hands such as ace queen, ace king are going to have a really hard time folding, having 2 pair now. Is our hand now vulnerable? I don't really think it is. If he does have ace x, he's only drawing very slim to 2 outs. So we don't mind checking this turn here. So we check with intentions of check calling and leading out at the river, but unfortunately our opponent checks behind. Then we get the river 7 of hearts, okay? This card right here obviously is a really safe card for us, and right now, given the line that we've taken, we expect to get value out of all of the ace 10 plus hands, basically out of all of our opponent's range if we do lead out at this river. So we do decide to lead out 400 into what the pot is now 620. And our opponent does something a little bit funny here. He min raises us to 800. Effective stacks, as you know, are 1300 here. So obviously this is a pot committing raise to 800 here. And we have a good hard think about how our opponents played the hand. In the end, we stick to what we know, and we expect that he's going to show up with ace king or ace queen here. And he decided not to bet the turn and decided to put in a bet for value. Against most opponents, we would expect them to bet this turn here if they did have ace king or ace queen of hearts and they had made a flush, which we're obviously not worried about anyway. But against this opponent, it's quite likely. So he can have, the nut flush here on the river. So we go all in for an extra 180 on top of his 800, and our opponent folds. Okay, he makes a miraculous fold here, or does he? Okay, so our opponent folds pocket aces, and later tells us that he put us on pocket 8s or 5-6 of hearts, and that he's the only player in the world that could possibly fold pocket aces in that situation. Okay, so obviously I'm joking around here. But this, as I said before, this is all about thought processes here, and how to take value optimal lines when we do have monster hands. Obviously, you'd have to be crazy to fold aces here, and there's only one player in the world that would do that. So before we get to the tables here, I just want to go over a couple of last things with you guys. The first thing, and the thing that's been drilled into you forever, right through your poker development, is position is crucial. So I want you to pay particular attention throughout the matches to the hand ranges that I'm opening in position as opposed to the hand ranges that I'm playing out of position, okay? And see what effect position has on my game. I also want you to pay attention to the adjusting and the adaptation that I'm going to talk about throughout the matches. We're going to focus on early game when we go through the live recording, and making them initial adjustments to our opponent's tendencies and the match dynamics at given points in time is going to be important. Also, value betting and taking value optimal lines. I need you guys to think about this, and we're going to discuss this throughout the matches. And one last point is thinking one level above your opponent. This is something that I'm going to go through in later videos of this series. But just quickly now, what I mean by this is basically, if your opponent is a level 2 thinker, the most optimal strategy you can take is thinking on level 3, okay? And being one step ahead of your opponent at any given point in time in a match is going to be crucial in your success as a heads-up sit-and-go player. Okay, so let's get to the tables right now. I'm going to pause the recording and I'll see you in a moment. Hey guys, I'm back here. I've got two $20 heads-up sit-and-goes on the screen here. But before I got into the live play, I just wanted to give you guys a quick look at this program here. This is the FishScope program I mentioned a little bit earlier. It's actually linked to SharkScope, so you actually have to have a SharkScope subscription to use it. But it's a really cool tool, and this is how it basically works. You type in the name, you click this button here, and you type in the name of the player, and it gives you the information on the player here on the left. You can also click here to get your recent results from that player, so you can see what kind of form he's in. But the graph also allows you to have a look at that, whether he's on a big downswing, or whether he's a constant winner over a long sample. So the most important things to be looking at when game selecting are the amount of games, the average stake, the ROI, and the total profits. Pretty much irrelevant. You need to look at the ROI, the amount of games, and the average stake that they've played. Sometimes you get people who are playing way above their means, so maybe they have an average stake of $1 or $2, and you kind of expect that they're going to be scared money if you find them sitting in a $100 heads-up sit and go, for example. So we're just going to roll on here. As you can see, I check out his recent results before we get into things. So on the left here, I'm dealt ace-4 offsuit here in the big blind. I don't see any need against an unknown here to be raising this hand. And on this board texture here, I'm obviously preoccupied at the moment looking up the players. But I don't see any real need in the early stages to get tricky here and go leading out at this flop or anything. Ace-9 suited on the right, I could be 3-betting as you see me threaten to do. However, I elect to just flat here. When you don't really know how a player plays, I think it's best to err on the safe or the passive side to start with. That's what I tend to do anyway. You can go the complete opposite and be completely aggressive with these guys and try to push them around from the word go. But personally, I like to push my edge post-flop and take a lot of flops and see how we go there before I get a feel for my particular opponent. On the left here, it's a pretty standard check fold. On the right here, we flop the nut flush draw. It's also a really good board to be c-betting. Okay, so we're not sure if our opponent yet understands good boards to c-bet and elements such as that. So what we're going to do here, we do know he's a winning player, so that's the only information we have on him right now, and it is only over a small sample. So what I'm going to do here is lead out at this flop. I think is the best line to take here to make sure that you start building the pot from the word go when our hand's so strong. So he calls and we turn the nut flush. Right now, you just have to keep betting. You just have to try to get as much chips in the middle as you possibly can. On the left here, 2-3 suited is a standard open here on the button in the early stages of a sit and go. I'm basically opening any suited cards whatsoever, with maybe the exception of like 9-2 and 7-2. But even then, sometimes I open them anyway. We do get 3-bet for the first time on the left, so we can expect that he's going to 3-bet us. Okay, so what I mean by that is already his 3-bet is here on the left, so we're going to keep an eye on that and see what percentage of hands he starts 3-betting us. If he does continue to 3-bet us, we're going to start adjusting our opening ranges, and we're also going to widen our 4-betting range here. As much as we don't really love 4-betting and getting it in when the stacks are this deep, we do need to open our range up and adjust to his 3-betting range, okay? His 3-bet was relatively small as well, so we also need to take note of that. On the right here, we open from the button with ace-8 of spades here, and we get called from the big blind. Obviously the pot's now 120, and we get a flop of 9-7-7, okay? So this flop here is a pretty good flop for us to be c-betting if he was to check to us. However, he donk leads out. Being early on in the match, we really have no idea whatsoever what this means. But as a default, I don't expect him to be donking out here with a 7 very often. There's certainly 9s in his range, but from my experience, there's actually a lot of draws and a lot of air in his range for making this donk lead here. So as you can see, early on, what I like to do here is to find out exactly what it means. So I go ahead here and put a raise in, and see how he responds to that raise. And if he was to, excuse me, continue here and shove over the top, obviously we're folding here. But the thing is that we've gained a lot of information and we're still relatively deep. So while the stacks are still relatively deep, we can get that information off our opponents. He limps his button here and we decide to raise the king-jack offsuit. we've already pressed a relatively aggressive dynamic here on the right, so we want to keep that dynamic aggressive here. It probably suits our game best for the dynamic to be aggressive. So here we raise out of position. This flop here isn't a great flop to be c-betting necessarily. Okay, when he limp calls there, a lot of the hands that he's limp calling with are not necessarily folding on this flop. Okay, there's a lot of middle cards in his range, some aces in his range, and a lot of them hands aren't really folding. So we wanted to a degree pot control, because quite often our king jack, if we do get to showdown and he does continue to check it behind, is going to be the best hand. Okay, but basically our intentions here are to check fold on this board, particularly when the 2 of spades rolls off here on the turn. Obviously it makes more sense for him to have a 6 here than it does for us, and he would expect us to bet an ace on the flop, so we kind of blew the chance that we had to represent the ace. So moving on. On the left here, 10-7 is an open. It's perfectly standard here on the left, and we do check fold the king jack on the right. Okay, so he 3-bets us again here. He 3-bets us to 3x here, and we are going to fold this time. On the right here, once again we've opened to our standard raise size of 60 with queens here on the right. We get a flop of jack 10-3. It's a pretty draw heavy board here, so when we start thinking about our PowerPoint presentation beforehand, we think about what are the chances that our hand's likely to remain the best hand, okay? Or what is the chances that we're likely to be to face scare cards here on the turn. And on a board like this, the chances that we are going to be facing scare cards is pretty high, okay? So what we want to do now, because we've already set up a dynamic here, where last time he made this donk lead full pot out into us on a flop, we did actually raise him. So we're going to go ahead and make the exact same move that we did last time, okay? We are going to raise him here on this flop to exactly the same size that we did last time, and see how he reacts this time. And this time here, he decides to cram over the top. Obviously we were raising here with intentions of snap calling a shove. The purpose of this raise was basically to get it in. Last time it was basically to get folds. This time, because we'd already set up the dynamic, our intentions right now are to be snap calling a shove, obviously. And we do, and he shows us queen jack, and he's drawing pretty thin. So, and we hold up and win that match. But let's have a look at this board here, because had we gone and played our hand a little bit slower, this turn card would have been perfect for us, but had he been check calling and he had shoved this river on us, we would have had a hard time getting the money in, okay? Both from his perspective and from our perspective, obviously a 10 would be a huge part of our range if we'd been calling him down, as well as a diamond draw, okay? So we want to get the chips in as fast as we can when we have a big hand like this. Okay, so let's move on. We have queen 2 offsuit here on the left, which is going to be a standard fold. Okay, so on the left here, thus far, he's kind of been running us over to a degree. He's been 3-betting us, and he's been raising a lot of his buttons, okay? So we have taken the more passive seat here. We open 5-6 offsuit here on the button, and we get a board of ace-3-6 with 2 diamonds. But this is a pretty standard c-bet board, okay? With the ace and the 2 low cards here, we're going to get folds a lot of the time here. So I recommend that you just go ahead and c-bet this board. Even though you have showdown value and you could pot control, we're likely going to be facing bets on later streets, so the best thing to do is take control of the pot and try to take the pot down with a c-bet right then. The pocket 5s here in the big blind, I like to just check them away. And we take a flop. This flop here, we're definitely check folding. I don't know if you've noticed all that much, but on this left table, I have donk led out at a couple of flops to him, and he snap folded both times, okay? So that's another thing we need to note, is when we've been out of position and he's limped pre-flop, we have donk led out at a couple of good flops, and he has snap folded both times. So we fold the 7-4 here on the button. I think it's more likely because I was trying to pull up another table at the time. The 8-9 suited here, we're going to check it away in the big blind. There's no need to raise it, it flops reasonably well. And on this flop, I think it's just a check fold. You know, even though we have bottom pair, it's marginal, it's very marginal, and we're out of position here. And as I mentioned earlier, we don't like playing marginal hands out of position. So once again, we have another game here on the right, another $20 heads up sit and go. They generally load up pretty quickly, so I thought I'd fire another one up because the first game was really quick. And we see that he's a massively losing player here over a pretty decent sample. On the left here, we open Queen 2 offsuit here and we flop top pair on a pretty draw heavy board. Okay, so we just go ahead and c-bet and take it down. Had he called here on the left, we were definitely probably checking back a lot of turns. Even though this board's really draw heavy, okay, we don't really want to build a huge pot with a hand which is relatively marginal, okay. We just want to get it to showdown. If he check-called this flop, obviously there's a lot of draws in his range, so we could be betting a lot of turns for protection, but what I like to do is keep the pot relatively small because the chances that we are going to face scare cards is relatively high. And I don't mind giving him a free card some of the time, and just hoping that our hand's good at showdown there. On the right here, we get Ace-King, so he limps, we're going to raise it up here. And he limp re-raises it, okay? This is generally signs of a reasonably strong hand, but what we do know about this opponent, even though it's first hand, is that he's a losing player over a decent sample, okay? So, the ranges for these players are typically quite wide, and particularly first hand, a lot of people like to do quite strange things. Okay, so with Ace-King offsuit here, we're definitely going to put another raise in. Our hand's like 90% of the time the best hand here, okay? So what we want to do is just get as much chips in as we can, and we're definitely going to be happy to get it in pre-flop here, even though we're 75 big blinds deep. You know, a lot of people would say to me, why would you take a flip at this stage of the match against a player that you know you're going to have a skill edge on? The fact of the matter is that in my experience, this isn't really a flip situation, okay? He can have, if he shoves over us here, he can have anything here. He can have 7-8 offsuit, he can have Ace-2 offsuit. There's so many hands in his range here. Being a losing player and being first hand of the match, they tend to do really, really silly things first hand of the match. So we go ahead here. We've got sixes here on the left, which is obviously an open. We go in and put a raise on the right. He re-pops us, and we're going to just shove. We get 3-bet again here, and we decide to defend the pocket sixes here. This flop right here is not a great flop, obviously, for our hand. In fact, it's horrible for our hand. But we haven't seen how he plays in 3-bet pots yet, okay? We do know that he is 3-betting us 33% of the time, okay? So he's 3-bet us a fair bit. But we're not sure how he reacts in 3-bet pots. So when he checks the flop to us here, this board, as much as it's bad for our hand, his 3-betting range here, we're still unsure of, okay? So, sure, he may check pocket aces or pocket jacks to us here, but I think this check is often a scared check. So I'm going to go ahead and fire out a c-bet into this pot. Because it's the first time we've peeled a 3-bet, I think the best thing to do here is to take one stab at the pot and see how he's going to play in 3-bet pots. On the right here, we get unlucky on the river, but that's just how it goes, okay? We got our money in really good. This hand here, it was obviously the top, towards the top of his range here. So we have no problem here. We lose first hand, but that doesn't matter all that much, okay? So we do go ahead here on the left. I hope we go ahead here and fire a bet off at this flop. We do fire a bet off here, and he calls, okay? So now we're just basically shutting down. We expect him to have at least a slight bit of this board now, and the board runs out horribly for us. If he was to check this river, I was thinking about over-shoving this river, because I don't think he's ever checking a flush here to us on the end. But as it is, he leads out at us anyway, so we get Ace-7 offsuit here. Now, if you notice, the effective stacks here are a bit less than 50 big blinds. This is the first time that we raise here from the big blind. We raise a limp, and it's the first time we've done it to him here on the left-hand table. This flop's pretty bad for us to be leading out, and once again, we don't really want to be making a big pot here out of position. So we are just going to hopefully check this pot down and get to showdown, because our hand does have showdown value, but this board here hits a lot of his range. So I think the best thing to do here is to not build a big pot out of position. 10-3 offsuit here, we're going to fold. So we're just tightening our range up a little bit here, if you've noticed, from the button. Because he has been 3-betting us a lot, and he has been defending a lot, I think the best thing to do is to tighten up a little bit here from the button. and play more for value when we do open from the button. Okay, so we donk lead out at this flop. That's pretty standard there. We flop top pair on a draw heavy board. We want to just protect our hand a little bit. Plus, on top of that, we've been getting a lot of folds here when he has limped, and we've donk lead out at flops. He's folded every time so far. So Jack 4 suited isn't open here, and once again he defends, and we get a pretty good flop here. Okay. So one thing we have noticed so far in the match is every time that he has defended from his big blind, he's check folded to our C bets, okay? But in this case, I think a lot of people are tempted to slow play, and they believe that because they've got trip jacks here, and on a board which their hand really isn't vulnerable on, that the best thing is to check back this flop and see if they can get some money in the pot on later streaks, okay? The best thing you can do here, especially when we've been C-betting a lot, is just to go ahead and try to build this pot, okay? I'm sure, there's not much that he can have on this flop, but because there's not much that he can have that hits this flop, he's also going to be floating this wide, because there's not much that we can have that hits this flop, okay? And because we have a C-bet dynamic when we've been in position, the best thing to do is to go ahead and try to build the pot. So we do put out our standard C-bet here, and once again he snap folds. But as I said, the best thing to do with your big hands is just to go ahead and bet. So he folds here on the button. Ace-3 offsuit here is definitely an open here on the button. And as you can see, I've tagged my raise size back to 80 here. I don't know why I brought this graph up here on the right. I guess it's just so you can look at how bad that player that just beat me was. King 6 suited is definitely an open here on the left. And right now, we're kind of getting the sense that the match dynamics are changing slightly, okay? We're getting the feel he's folding a lot of his buttons, and he's also starting to fold a lot from the big blind as well, okay? So, just that fact that he's changing gears, we need to take note of the changing dynamic in the match, okay? He just seems to be getting a little bit more passive, and starting to play a little bit tighter pre-flop. Whether that has to do with the effective stacks or not, I'm not 100% sure. We do know that this guy's a losing player, so we're not sure if he is adjusting to the stack sizes or not. But we have noticed that he has started to tighten up a little bit pre-flop. Okay, so once again he limps here. We get a flop here, which if we're in position, is a really good board to C-bet. And we had been donking out with relative success so far, so we decided to go ahead and try to donk out and take it down again. This time we get called. The Queen of Clubs is a really bad card on the turn because we expect him to be floating us with a lot of draws like Jack 10, 10-8, Queen 10, a lot of hands which are going to hit this card. Plus on top of that, by him calling here once he's never called before when we've donk let out, I tend to believe him that he's got a piece of it, and he leads out at the turn and we just fold. Queen on offsuit here in the big blind. He makes a raise, and he hadn't been raising much as we just noticed. So we are just going to fold this hand. Even though it's not a bad hand to defend when you're a little bit deeper, I don't really like defending it here. It's pretty easily dominated. So Ace-7 offsuit here is definitely a raise as we previously mentioned. I'm going to be opening all aces from the button. 4-2 offsuit in the big blind will be a fold, obviously. Two, 3 offsuit, we're going to be folding, okay? So, we're kind of getting a bad run of cards right now. We don't really need to push things, okay? We're still relatively deep. We've still got over 30 big blinds. So we don't really want to just go pushing ourselves out of this game by making spewy plays, okay? King 10 suited, offsuit, sorry, is obviously an open here on the button. I've gone down to one table here, obviously. I didn't really feel the need, considering we're going to stop this video after we finish the 1530 level. So I didn't really feel the need to go ahead and open up another table here. So Jack 5 suited, it's definitely an open again on the button. I'm opening most suited cards. And right now, on this flop we're going... Okay, so on this flop we're going to be c-betting, okay? If he checked this board to us, we're going to be c-betting 100% of the time. And probably shutting down to any diamond on the turn, obviously. Actually, we're going to be shutting down on most turns, providing it's not an offsuit jack or 5. But what he does here is he actually donk leads out full pot at us. Now, what I mentioned before about raising the first time they do this, the effective stacks now are a lot shorter than what they were over here in the first match that we played. So I don't really like raising here, because he's basically he's going to be shoving on us with any diamond, any 9, basically any piece of this board really. So our hand's likely not good against his range to be donking out here, and seeing as though it's the first time he's done it, and it's so deep into the match now, I'm generally going to give him a little bit more credit for doing this. As much as our hand here will have showdown value, it isn't likely to remain the best hand. So I don't like getting stubborn here, and I think the best play here is just to shut down and just fold the hand. So we do fold, I'm glad. 10-8 offsuit here in the big blind, where once again we're not going to defend it. As you can see, we're not defending a very wide range here at all from the big blind. Basically just broadways. Queen 3 offsuit here is a raise from the button, and once again we get a fold from the big blind. Keep moving forward here. A6 offsuit here in the big blind, he folds. Okay, so the match dynamics have been a little bit back and forth of late, okay? So basically we're raising, he's folding, he's raising, we're folding, okay? So it's just a little bit of jabbing around here at the moment. Not much is really happening here. Probably somewhat to do with the run of cards that we've had. And we're not sure on his end. But sometimes you just have to be patient and wait for the hands to come to you. Particularly when effective stacks dip around about the 30 big blind mark. You don't want to really be making too many spewy moves because you don't have that much margin for error. Here in the big blind we're dealt King 10 and we do decide to defend. We get a flop of Ace King 4, and when we had been, we hadn't flattered much here from the big blind. I actually can't remember an instance where we had flattered from the big blind, to be honest with you. But he had been, in all pots that we checked to him here, he'd basically been firing away at every flop. So right now he does fire full pot here at the flop, and we're going to go ahead and check raise him here, and we're going to be calling a shove. We're going to commit ourselves to the pot. By all chances, our hand is the best hand here. When he's been c-betting such a high percentage, we're going to be happy to go to the felt with our hand there. Particularly because this board's relatively draw heavy, okay? There's some flush draws here. He may shove over us with hands like Queen Jack, Jack 10. I'm not going to put it past him. Obviously, he's going to be shoving with aces, but we expect to be folding out a lot of kings here when we do check raise as well. Okay? So, basically, we'll go into the felt there purely because we were putting in over half our stack there, and we were doing it for value. So 6-8 off here. Once again, we're going to open here on the button. And we kind of took a little bit of an aggressive line, and it's the first time we'd really taken an aggressive action. Okay? So the first time we take an aggressive action against this guy, and the very next hand we go ahead and we open, which is a pretty standard open for us, and he just overshoves here. He overshoves, what's that? Well, we're playing around about 40 big blinds effective, so he's effectively shoving in 40 big blinds there pre-flop, okay? So this is just bad on his behalf, okay? Obviously, it's a reaction to the last hand, and you quite often see this happen. So it's really great sometimes when you wake up with a hand, the very next hand after you've done something like that to this type of opponent. But we are going to note that he's done this, okay? And we're just going to continue on with the match. So the effective stacks, we've got our chips back a little bit. We're getting back towards even a little bit. And he limps his button here, and we check away the 9-2. Okay, so once again here, we're going to donk out at this flop. We do actually have a strong draw here, okay? So we've got the flush draw, we've got the gut shot straight draw. Okay, I don't expect him to have aces here a lot, so we do expect to get folds, which is a good scenario for us, but we're also building a pot here for if we do get our draw there. So we're going to go ahead and donk out, which we've been donking out full pot when we had. And this time, once again, like the last time when the dynamic changed here a little bit, he'd been, as you can note, he had been folding a lot beforehand. This time he calls. Okay, the turn card is not great for us, but we're going to donk out again. Okay, he has no idea whatsoever what our range is for donking out. Okay, we haven't shown a hand down yet. We did fold the last time. I think it was on a King 7 free board or something like that. So he really has no idea what our range is here for donking out. But he does know that last time we check folded the turn. I don't expect him to have aces here a lot, so I'm going to go ahead here and donk out again at the turn card, because I think we get folds a lot of the time. And he could just be floating this light by him noting that we had been doing this a fair bit. So on the turn here, I'm pretty sure he'd disconnect. Not sure, but I am going to pause the video because I'm pretty sure he disconnects for a whole minute. I do pause the video in real time, but I'm going to pause it now as well. Okay, so we're back now where he reconnects, and he calls this turn card, okay? And we hit gin, obviously, on the river. So we're going to go ahead here and bet for value once again. We have no idea what he's calling us down with, and if he is calling us here with a bigger flush draw, then good luck to him. We're going to the felt with this hand if he does raise us here on this river. You know, we can't really deduce that he can have the flush draw here. We actually have not much of an idea what his range for calling two streets is. We're starting to believe that he maybe does have an ace, maybe a weak ace like ace-6, ace-7, hopefully ace-8 where he may put in a raise here. But we do expect him to have a piece of this board now, so we are going to go ahead here and bet for value. We get value out of a lot of hands here on the end. So we decide to bet 300 into 420. Now I think he calls. He does call very quickly here, okay? And now we get a chip lead here, okay? So as you can see through this hand, what we'd previously done in this match is donking out a lot. Had some dry flops here and there, and we formed that dynamic, okay? Where we had been donking out at flops, and he'd just been snap folding to every time we donked out. Then he made an adjustment. He started calling here. Okay, so he started calling when we were donking out. He called one time, and then when we checked the turn to him, he bet the turn. So this time, once again, we go ahead and donk out, and once again he calls. Okay, I believe that he's only calling here based on the previous information that he had that we were prepared to donk out a lot of flops. Okay, so that's the last hand that I'm going to show you guys. What I am going to show you, however, is the hand that he had. He had 10-7 offsuit. So as we can see, what he was doing there is he was basically floating us, and he was going to try to take it away on the turn, had we checked the turn to him. The only reason he would do this is based on the match dynamics and the fact that we had been donking out and he had been folding a lot. And then he used the information that he got last time when we check folded the turn, and he was going to try to use that against us again here, okay? Because we did have a draw here, a pretty strong draw, and we did lead out the turn, and we got lucky that he hit this turn, he called again, and obviously we got value from our hand, okay? So basically, the match dynamics up to this point have led to this hand, and we've used everything that we've done previously and that he's done previously to get the most value that we possibly can in this hand and to take a value optimal line, okay? Had that river been a brick, obviously we were just going to check fold, and he was going to win the hand. I expect him to be checking back behind us if the turn was a brick anyway, given that he did have showdown value now. So that's going to end the video today. I'm not going to play out this video because it did go on for a fair while afterwards, and the video is kind of getting pretty long now anyway. I really hope you guys have enjoyed this. This is part 1 of a 3-part series on heads up sit and goes. If you have any questions or any feedback, please leave it in the forum. I'm on the forum about 40 hours a day. No, but in all seriousness, I am around the forums a lot of the time. So feel free to post hands. If you do start playing some heads up sit and goes, feel free to post them hands. I'm more than happy to take a look at them for you. And if you have any questions or feedback about the video, just leave them in the forum. This is Matthew MJW006 Wakeman for Pokersavvy Plus, signing out for my first and hopefully not my last video.